Room 413. The hospital at night was a different world. During the day, its bright, sterile corridors bustled with doctors, nurses, and patients, a place of healing and comfort. But when night fell, the familiar hum of the hospital quieted, and its empty hallways felt foreboding, like a dormant beast waiting in the shadows. Emma, a new night shift nurse, had quickly learned to avoid certain parts of the hospital during her rounds. In particular, she dreaded the fourth floor, an older wing that was largely unused except for a few storage rooms and occasionally overflow patients. There was one room, however, that always caught her eye on the night shift. Room 413. It was an empty room, at least that's what the staff insisted. Officially, it was listed as unassigned, and no patients were supposed to be there. Yet, every so often, the call light for room 413 would flicker on at night. Emma had heard stories from other nurses, of course, but she brushed them off as silly gossip. Hospitals attracted enough myths and legends on their own. She didn't need to add ghosts to the list. It was a quiet night, and Emma's rounds had been uneventful so far. She passed by the nurses' station, glancing at the glowing board of call lights. Room 413's light was on, flickering steadily. A chill crept up her spine as she stopped to look at it. The charge nurse, Linda, looked up from her paperwork, her eyes hardening as she noticed Emma staring. "Just ignore it," she said firmly. "Has someone checked in there recently?" Emma asked, forcing her voice to sound casual. Linda shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "No one's been assigned to 413 for years." Emma swallowed, hesitating. "But if someone needs help—" "Listen," Linda interrupted, her gaze stern. "If that light goes on during your shift, you ignore it. No one's in there." Linda's warning hung in the air as Emma continued her rounds, but she couldn't shake the eerie feeling the light had left her with. She told herself it was probably just a wiring issue. The hospital was old, and things like that happened all the time, she reasoned. But as her shift wore on, she found herself lingering near room 413's closed door. She reached out, testing the handle. It was locked, just as she'd expected. But that did little to ease her nerves. If the room was locked, how could the call light be going off? A little after 3 a.m., she passed the nurse's station again, glancing at the call board. The light for room 413 was still flickering, as if persistently asking for attention. Her pulse quickened, and despite Linda's warning, curiosity began to overtake her hesitation. She decided to check it out herself, reasoning that it would be better than just standing around imagining things. Emma approached room 413, the soft glow from the hallway lights casting long shadows across the door. She gently turned the handle, surprised to find it unlocked this time. As the door creaked open, a shiver ran down her spine. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. It looked like every other room in the hospital: a bed, a side table, and a chair by the window. But the air felt wrong. It was stale and unnaturally cold, with a faint metallic smell that reminded her of rusted metal or dried blood. Goosebumps prickled along her arms as she stepped further in, half expecting to find a patient lying there despite Linda's insistence. The bed was empty, neatly made, as if waiting for its next occupant. Yet, as she turned to leave, a movement caught her eye in the corner of the room. It was a small shape, a shadow, hunched and motionless, barely distinguishable in the dim light. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. The shadow remained still, and she couldn't make out any details. It looked like a figure curled into itself, maybe a child or a very small adult. She inched closer, each step heavy with dread, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. When she was just a few feet away, the figure lifted its head slightly, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to gleam in the dimness. Emma's breath caught as those eyes locked onto hers, filled with a depth of sorrow and despair that she couldn't begin to understand. Frozen in place, she whispered, Are you okay?" The figure's mouth opened and a faint, wheezing voice came out. "Help. Me." Emma's heart raced as she felt an overwhelming urge to run, but something about the plea held her there, as if it had wrapped around her, binding her to the spot. What do you need?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers bony and skeletal, the skin stretched thin and pale. Emma took a hesitant step forward, instinctively reaching out, though her mind screamed at her to turn and run. Just before her fingers could touch the figure's hand, the room's light flickered off, plunging her into total darkness. Panic surged through her, and she pulled her hand back, stumbling backward. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she felt for the door behind her, desperate to escape. The light flickered back on, and the figure was gone. The bed was empty, the corner was empty, as if no one had ever been there. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. Had it been a trick of the light? An overactive imagination? She turned to leave, her heart still pounding, but as she reached the door, she heard it. The faint sound of breathing coming from the bed. She whipped around, eyes wide, and saw the sheets slowly rising and falling, as if an invisible body lay beneath them. Emma's instincts kicked in, and she bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She leaned against it, her heart hammering as she tried to catch her breath. Linda was standing at the end of the hallway, watching her with a knowing, almost sorrowful expression. "You went into 413, didn't you?" she asked softly. Emma nodded, still too shaken to speak. Linda sighed. "Years ago, a patient passed away in that room. A little girl. She was waiting for her parents, but they never came. Ever since then, people have seen things in there. She calls for help, waiting for someone to save her. But no one can." Emma felt a cold sweat break out across her skin as Linda continued. "Every night, she reaches out to someone. She just wants someone to stay with her." The realization hit Emma with full force, and a hollow fear settled deep in her chest. She had seen the little girl, or at least, whatever was left of her. As she turned to walk back down the hallway, she glanced one last time at room 413. The call light had stopped flickering, but just as she breathed a sigh of relief, her own call light, the one for her shift, began to flicker softly, insistently. And from down the hallway, she swore she heard a faint whisper, a child's voice echoing through the empty corridor. "Don't leave me alone.